This project checks a lot of boxes. I'm finishing a UFO, I'm using up scrap fabric, and I'm learning a new technique.
The time is now.
I am going to be working on my UFO of my butterflies. I have 8 blocks finished, and I want to do something besides just butterflies. So I am going to make an alternative pattern that will work with the butterflies. I have had all of this fabric, and it's just beautiful fabric. So I came up with a star block. This was so easy. I took the square, this is the finished size of this pattern, and I literally just traced it on a piece of paper. And then what I did was I made my 4 blocks, 1, 2, 3, 4, and literally I went from the center and measured up and then drew my lines. And so the pattern basically is 1 square, and you just make 4, put them together, and you have your star block. I went to 3/4 of an inch from center point, and literally this is my pattern. So it's 3 inches finished, 3.5 unfinished. Paper piecing is what I'm going to do, and I happen to have on hand some perfect piecing. It's a foundation sheet, and this is by June Taylor. I have never done foundation piecing, so I just happen to have this on hand, and so I'm using what I have, which is really exciting to me. I took my pattern and I copied it through my laser printer onto my foundation sheets, and that's it. Isn't that exciting? So my plan is to alternate butterfly, star, butterfly, and so I'm going to need 8 butterfly blocks, which I have 8 finished right here, and then 7 stars, and I'm thinking about maybe doing a border of stars. So if I do, I'll need 20 extra, but I definitely need 7 of the star blocks for the center. I am chain piecing these, and so I have my pattern on my foundation. I am starting with this first piece here, right side up. Make sure you cover the entire pattern, and this right here is going to be my stitch line. So I'm just literally lining everything up on the edge, roughly 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, flipping it over, and there's my stitch line. One thing I did do with the pattern, a little change that I made, is I did not have the stitch lines here, the actual lines for my points of my stars, all the way into the seam allowance. And so I went ahead and I added that. It just kind of helps, it makes it easier. The other thing that I would do differently also is I would use a finer marking utensil, whatever you're going to use. The finer, the more precise it'll be. And then we literally stitch. And the other thing I needed to watch for is this width here and how it tapers down in my little pieces. So I was having to make sure that I was at the widest spot to make sure that when this turns, I'm going past this next sew line. And we keep going. So now I literally am just going to chain piece all these, and it's literally the same process over and over. And you know, I kind of think that once I get into the process, it'll go a lot faster. got these chain pieced, and I am going to go to the cutting table and I'm going to fold these back and trim that to 1/4 inch. I'm ready to start stitching the second or final piece of my block. You can see my stacks over here. I am all ready to go. And I also wanted to point out that I have my stitch length kind of tuned down a little. So my stitch is smaller. It's a 2.0 on my machine. So let's get sewing. Make sure again when you finger press this open that this is nice and flush. There's no puckers or gaps in there. And we have right side up, so this is going to be right side down. Cover. And again, I am literally just chain piecing now. While you're still piecing your block and you're at your machine, keep in mind the point of your stars. You want to make sure that the intersection of these two sew lines is not within your seam allowance. You want it to be within this solid line so that it'll be within your block. If it extends into this seam allowance, just keep in mind when you go to sew your blocks together, that point will be cut off. Instead of having a finished point, you're going to end up with a blunt point. All right, it is time to start pressing. All of my edges are neatly trimmed, and I am going to set my seam and fold it back and press. Now I'm pressing, not ironing, and at this point we want to make sure that this ironing line is right up against our sew line. It's going to give us a nice clean edge and nice pretty points. Flip it over, give it a press, and we are going to continue. Again, set your seam open, make sure we're all the way open, and press. Flip it over. Then the next step will be to trim on these dash lines, and we'll have a nice square block. And then once that is done, then we will start sewing them together to make our star. Before I go any further though, I want to show you a couple of things that I came across while I was sewing. I'm not sure what happened, but my fabric isn't covering my entire design. The other thing I have going on, can you see that? How I have that bubble? Definitely that will go under the seam ripper. I also have one where when I went to do the trimming, I forgot to fold this back, and so I cut it. If that happens to you, don't sweat it. Just put a piece of tape on there and keep going, because eventually this will be taken off anyway. So I am going to keep going on my pressing, and as soon as I am done, I will see you for the next step. When squaring up my blocks, I like to start at the point, and I'll start by lining up my 45. Then I will line up my solid, and then line up your dash line. And then I make my cuts. Take your time when doing this. This is the foundation for your block, and then repeat the process. Line up my 45, line up my solid, and then line up my dashed, and make my cuts. And there's our squared up block. So the next step is going to be to start assembling these together like so. I will sew these two here, these two here, and once those are stitched, then I will sew here. When that is done, I will have a completed block. Yay! Once I get all of these put together, then I'm going to start laying out different blocks on the design wall. Then I'll just start sewing them row by row. I'll sew one row, and then I'll sew another row, and then I'll put the rows together. We'll see in a bit. Whew, my rows are sewn together and the quilt top is finished. Doesn't the star pattern create such a beautiful secondary design? The quilting design I'm thinking about for this quilt will push me out of my comfort zone. Join me to explore the quilting of this top.